What's up, YouTubers? Chuck here. I'm here with Raven Mimura. He is a fantastic artist that does some board game, role-playing game art for the industry. You know, one thing we were talking about earlier was your 12-year gaming group. I think that's just fantastic. The fact that you've had so much dedication to that group, and also being in the industry, I mean, and you also talked about doing this really early on, like you were 4th grade.
Yeah.
So you've kind of known. How has being in a group like that, like, affected just your take on the artwork and where you go with it, and kind of your inspiration, and I don't know, just lay it on.
Well, I think one thing, I really understand what sort of the audience wants, and it's not that I'm trying to pander to my audience exactly, but like, I love a lot of detail, and I know that the audience, the gamers, love a lot of detail. So I just know when I'm going that extra mile and really thinking about what tiny little gear, what gear that the character has, or what little insignia that I can try to work into the scroll work and some armor, where probably nobody's going to see it, but if somebody does see it, they're going to be like, oh my god, that's the symbol for whatever god.
That's awesome that you pay so much attention to detail, and just being involved, I think, is just something that allows you to be able to do those things. It's really neat to me. It's just because a lot of people, they go in and it's like, okay, we want this, and then they create art, and you actually have some inspiration behind what you do, and some knowledge, and some
one thing that I find, they'll give you certain materials, like reference materials, whatever you need, so that you can do the artwork. But I'm always asking for, like, give me more. Tell me, like, give me the write-up on this god. Give me, or for games that aren't out yet, sometimes I'm working on the core rulebook of something. I'm like, don't just give me the passage that tells me about this character or this race. If you have it, give me the manuscript, and I just want to read the whole thing, or I want to skim all so that I want to know everything about the setting, and really, so I can really get the right feel. And also, it's basically almost with those details, sometimes it's like Easter eggs that, mostly nobody's going to see it, but if they do, they're going to be like, that's awesome. Because I know, I love seeing that. I love seeing that in other work. So.
I was actually going to ask that too. When a publisher comes to you, and like, what kind of varying degrees of information do you get? Like, are they like, we want an ogre?
Well,
what do you get, like a little small smidget, or do you get like details, or do you get like a backstory?
It varies somewhat widely. My preference is the least amount in the art description with the most amount of extra information that I can draw from, but I'm not required to draw from.
Do you typically get like a lot of leeway with your design concepts, or do they kind of micromanage it a little bit?
That really depends on the property and the company, and sometimes the art director. But I definitely like when I have the most leeway. The standard, just to give an example, for an art description, let's say for Dungeons and Dragons, for, let's say, a smaller piece that's not too complicated, maybe it's supposed to be a certain spell, and so they'll give you, we want a female elf robe in leather armor with a crossbow in one hand, that's reading a scroll or something, casting this spell, hitting an ogre in a wooded area. And so it's up to you to decide if sometimes they'll say it's at night, sometimes they'll say it's at day. Sometimes the setting can be a little more specific, or sometimes it's just wooded, or maybe a clearing, or maybe something like that. And that's usually basically sort of the race, sex, class, and the basic gear. But then you provide, like, well, of course, there's no rogue ever that just has 2 items, has leather armor and a crossbow. It's like, you populate it with the rest of your stuff, and you get to design you get to design the armor in a case like that. So that's a pretty standard art description. But there are other times, and I like to do this whenever I can, that if I can negotiate to do this, say we want a chapter header for our chapter on magic. In that case, I get to, and all I have to do is I do something really appropriate for their game. I'm not going to put a Space Marine, in a game, in a high fantasy game, but I get to do something, take a character or character type or class or race from their game that's appropriate, have them casting, make the focus of the piece magic. Other than that, they don't tell me anything. And that's what I really like to do. Because I will do something that's really appropriate for your game, that's well researched, and really has the right feel and vibe for your game. But if I just get to play, then I'm going to choose what really is inspiring and interesting for me. And almost always, the pieces always come out better that way, because I'm just personally invested, and I always go the extra mile for myself. You don't have to make me do, I'm never going to skimp just because I want to do a really kick-ass piece.
Well, and you obviously do, so.
Thank you.
I mean, do you ever, if you're given this, just open-ended, we just want an elf or something just something very simple, very vague. Do you ever pull from your gaming group, think of an adventure that y'all had and be like, I'm gonna do this because it was an amazing time that we had to play together? Yeah.
It definitely, there are certain little things here and there that sometimes inform or inspire me. I think the most, I don't know if egregious is the right word, but one of the a prominent example of that is that I did a third edition or a third-party publisher monster manual cover for Pathfinder, and I sort of negotiated that they weren't necessarily able to pay the rate that I would normally be able to command, but my negotiation point was that I got to do whatever I wanted, rather than getting an assignment, and they were going to sort of work around that. So I actually I came up with a monster that was a variation of the weird made-up character, sort of character class that I made up for my Pathfinder game in my previous campaign. And so that entire cover it really is just a character portrait, but I kind of made it into a monster, and then they actually took one of the Pathfinder writers and got them to sort of a special guest writer and to write up the monster after the fact. And that's another thing, we're always at the beck and call of the writers. Normally, they write the stuff, the manuscript is done, they do the editing, and then they order the art. The art is always the very last thing before just the final layout and going to print. So it's super rare that we get to just paint whatever we want, and then the writer has to follow our decree, And I've had a couple of opportunities to do that, and when I've talked to writers, they say that that's really fun because they don't get to do that. They don't get to see a piece of art that really inspires them and I don't know what this is, but it's got these really long hook hands, why would it have that? And trying to figure out the ecology of that monster or the mechanics of it, and trying to make a really balanced, interesting monster that has a reason for being. We always have to do what they tell us, and so it's nice to just let our minds wander, and then they have to jump through the hoops that we've already set for them.
And yeah, speaking as more of a modern board gamer, not role player type design stuff. I mean, typically we come up with a game, we come up with mechanics, we grab some icons or some very simple GIFs or something and throw it onto a piece of paper and say, this is our card, and we're gonna play it like this, and no, that's a house. I don't care if it looks like a block. And then you get it done, and then you send it, to the artist, and I mean, it's very similar. That's very common. And I mean, we've been talking with people here today that they talk about, the designers tend to look at mechanic first,
right,
and then they look at theme. And I'm kind of along the lines of with Sam Healy, where he says, I like them to be integrated. I want a theme that makes sense for the mechanic. I mean, just like the story.
Where you couldn't swap out the theme for another theme.
Yes.
They're
that makes such a better game whenever those things just mesh. And a lot of times, there are some games that are really good games, and the artwork's just not very good. And it runs the game for me. Like, in having good artwork, I mean, really just it makes it pop.
Yeah.
And good design.
Well, I think in ideal circumstances, which are sometimes it's hard to manage this, but if you have an artist that is collaborating in the design stage, then those things can naturally, and you can do some art that inspires the designers, rather than the designers try to live in their bubble and they make the mechanics and they make the setting, and then the artist comes in and tries to bring that to life. The fact is, the artist is really good at coming up with ideas as well, and when there's some back and forth to it, the writers actually come up with new ideas and new avenues of thought and new ways of making the mechanics fit the theme as well. And so it's not always possible to have that give and take, but in the circumstances where it is, I think really great things can happen.
So when you get to work with those, and I know you do mostly role-playing, but like if you do card games or things like that, how often do you get to help like integrate the mechanic of the card, like what the symbology is, into the artwork? Do you do that very often, or is it usually just like kind of the background art or the main characters?
I think most of the time when I've done board games, I think it's usually pretty cut and dry. Like they say this is what and frequently in that case they don't even tell me what the mechanic is. Which can sometimes be frustrating when you do the piece, they give you the art description, so you do it, and then you see the card, and you're like, this card mechanically doesn't make sense. I don't feel like this.
It's like old school Magic the Gathering. It's they say, here's the name of the card, and you get there's a red background, and then there's it doesn't match.
I love as an artist, I loved it back in that day, because I was like, it was sort of like I was talking about with that. Do a chapter piece for our magic, our spells chapter, like where you just, I don't know, I can do whatever I want as long as it's spell oriented, and that where you just get a title and just run with it. I think that's awesome. I mean, I certainly as they're trying to build their brand and sort of make it a little more cohesive, I can see why that unraveled.
Yeah, they're very story driven now, so a lot of the artwork kind of meshes together.
But I also understand, like, it's been clear that in times when, both in role-playing games and in card games, that you do the art and then they're still monkeying with things. So they have the art, but now they've had to change a minor tweak in the rules, or just the set of cards, like just for good mechanical balance. They're like, okay, this is a little bit strange. We need to swap out some new rules for that, and then it stops coinciding quite as well with what the art was, but they don't have either the time or the budget to reassign the art.
How often do you have to like just completely redo something? Does it happen often, or is it just like kind of rare instances? Or?
It's pretty rare. First of all, I think I'm really meticulous, so I try to strip away any time where it's my fault. I think it's super rare that I've just missed some important detail and screwed up, because I'm just really meticulous about it. But there are times when, I mean, I've worked with companies where I do exactly what they say, and then I turn in a sketch, and my sketches are even, there's a color rough or there's tone to it, like, so it's like 75% done, so you know exactly what you're going to get, and it gets approved, and then I do the final, and then they're like, can we have these changes? I'm like, you could have had those changes at the sketch stage.
Yeah, and
it doesn't happen much, thankfully, but in those projects, I either, after I try to just get it done, and hit my deadline, and then maybe after the fact, either I'm like, I just don't think this culture is going to change, I'm going to just not work with that company again. Or I'm like, I bring it up with the art director, like, I don't know where in the process where the breakdown is, and usually it's not the art director, usually it's some other part of the approval process, and I'm like, this isn't working for me, and I'm sure no artist likes doing this, and you get worse art by, and
the quality of their game is just going to go down,
and you alienate artists that you chose me because you wanted me to do work for you, and now this is an untenable situation that I don't like. I really don't like that. This should be fixed. I mean, I know you need what you need, But if I gave you a sketch, you should have known at that point whether you were getting what you needed.
Well, and I've done commissioned artists before for some video game characters that I have, and I know the process. You know, you get like 5, 6 different poses and sketches, and then you get an update of the line work, and then you get some, you know, basic flats, and then then you get the detail work, and then you get step by step. So it's not like you just get this
there was
process.
no surprise.
It's, you knew it was coming. You should have found something way early on, and I've made comments before like I didn't really care for, you know, let's change this before it gets too detailed.
Right.
And
that's when the change needs to happen.
Yeah, and I guess their argument is, well, we're spending the money. Well, you should have known.
Well, if I've shown you what it's going to be, and you have a change that was 3 iterations ago, like, you should have caught that at the time.
Now, another thing, I was going to go back to some previous conversations. The like kind of stuff being done and then the artwork coming last. I know a lot of big game publishers, they don't want art because they want to just play the game, and then, you know, the designer goes and pitches the game to them, they get it, and then they decide, okay, well, we don't like your theme, we're going to give it a new theme.
Right.
And so if a designer has spent a lot of money on artwork, and it doesn't matter how good it is, and they decide that, I mean, it's a wash at that point. They've wasted money on some thing, and from my understanding, I've never had this firsthand experience, but a lot of publishers are like that. I mean, actually, do you deal with a lot more big publishers or like small indie publishers?
I was working pretty exclusively with all larger publishers, but I think that I was excited to be working on the top properties, but because they're the favorites that I grew up with that made me want to do this in the first place. But because I have less, even in situations where I was pretty high up on the food chain, I knew that with my art directors, I was one of their, you know, important people, one of the important artists in their stable. I can't make all these demands of getting more creative control. So I've started working with smaller publishers where I get to say, well, you can't really afford me, but I'll do the work if I get a lot more creative control. Because then I was getting burned out just cranking out work for, even though it was my dream job, but your dream job can grind you into a paste at some point, and I was starting to feel that. So I've been taking more independent, sort of smaller publishers, where I get to, you know, I give them work that's actually better than the work I've ever done, really. But because it's more personal to me. But so yeah, I've been getting more projects where I have more creative control. So I have been working with smaller, like mid-range or newer publishers more recently.
Well, I guess I have one last question. Like, compared to when you started to now, like how progressively has your artwork improved over the ages?
I've actually had a couple conversations this weekend that I think if you took my portfolio from, let's say, either the first year or maybe the portfolio that I first took to Gen Con when I was first trying to get work, and my portfolio now, and then you took some random third person's portfolio and mixed them all up and tried to choose the 2 that were mine, I don't know that you could do it. Because my work is so fundamentally different than it was. So, one, it's a lot better, but also stylistically I've changed a great deal. And I used to not be comfortable with working in color. Now it's second nature to me. It's intuitive finally. So my work is just night and day from what it used to be. And
is it all purely digital? Do you sketch by hand?
No, it's purely digital. I think I know a lot of artists that are digital artists. They still work in pencil. I mean, real live pencil, scan it, and then do the painting from there. With me, the digital process is so much. I love the flexibility that it gives me during every stage, including the drawing stage.
Well, thanks again for talking with me,
absolutely.
You know, spending some time over here to just have a conversation about art. I love art. And anyway, Raven Mimura, you have a website, somewhere they can go to check out your work?
It's ravenmimura.com. That's Mimura.
So, very sweet. Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks.